It is very common for women leaders to define the stages of their career alongside or in parallel with the families that they're raising. So you'll often hear them say things like, well, when my daughter went into preschool, I did this with my career, or the sort of parallelness of kids growing up and a career evolving through those different seasons. And so today on the Underdog Leadership Podcast, I wanted to dissect and sort of unpack this idea of mothering in the workplace. And I think it's a really interesting topic. The theme that I want to talk about is beware of mothering your team to incompetence. And I want to look at the mothering habits, how they show up at the workplace, and how they might be doing a disservice to your team. So I've set the stage that being a mother, and for those of you that aren't mothers, this isn't a defining characteristic of any woman by any means, but it is sort of a mile marker and a bit of a growth by by waterfall, right? So when you have children, things change very quickly and you have to adapt the patterns and habits in your life. So your career when you have children is usually intertwined with motherhood. As an aside, one of the things I notice when I go on business trips with men, I am most comfortable when we're at the cocktail hour or when we're out for dinner talking about my family and my children. And I notice that some men do not reciprocate that. It's just not part of their lexicon of conversation. It's not something they think about in a work environment. So I flag that as I have had to shift or change or alter how I show up in some of those meetings. And as more and more women become part of the workplace, we're going to see more integrated conversations of work and life. So we've discussed that the career is defined in parallel with their families. One of the most challenging things around motherhood is trying to figure out with kids when to step in and when to wait and let them figure it out on their own. That parallels incredibly nicely with staff in the workplace. And it came up recently with a client that I was working with in a coaching situation. And she was talking about how an employee had made an error, a mistake, and that she had kind of swooped in and fixed it. And I had asked the coaching question, well, and how did the employee react to the follow-up on that mistake that had been fixed? And she looked at me and she said, oh, I didn't include her in that follow-up. And I think there's a lot of reasons this happens. So I think people want to protect their staff like a mother would. They want to take away the pain, the uncomfortableness of the situation. Sometimes they're just too plain busy to actually coach the employee back to fix the mistake. And the good old famous one, they want to avoid confrontation. And so for all of those reasons, the executive in this position had swooped in, fixed the mistake, fixed the error with the people that were involved, but had not looped back with the employee or had not allowed the employee the opportunity to fix that mistake. I think of it in parallel with helping kids go to university. It's so much easier and faster to tell them where they're going or to tell them that there's 3 schools they can pick from, right? The harder thing and the thing that takes more time is to spend time with those children and those young adults, help them go through the decision process, which, by the way, sidebar, can be incredibly painful, to walk to these different spaces, these different universities or colleges, and help them make the decision for themselves. That moment of autonomy, those pieces of core motivation, how they feel involved in those decisions, we know from the research means that the decisions stick better and they start getting more confident, trusting themselves. So as a leader, who doesn't want to do that for their staff, right? But it does take time and it does take patience. I mean, some days it can feel like you don't have either of them. So let's unpack this a bit. These good intentions of protecting, these good intentions of wanting to take care of things for folks, these good intentions of, I'll just do it, it'll take me 2 minutes, may actually be backfiring on you. You may know the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think this is a great example. You need, as the leader, if you're going to build capacity within your team, you need to walk beside them, empower them to take on these new things, especially if they're uncomfortable, and take the time to show and support them and coach them through those mistakes or those challenges. And that phrase, I'll just do it myself, that's fine. It's faster today, but it's not faster on the long run. This brings up another topic that I am fascinated from, the concept of delegation. So on the surface, delegation sounds very simple. It's delegating tasks to other people. So then, folks, why is it so hard to do? Why do we get caught up in our heads about delegating? I think there's the actual tasks, and then I think there's the psychological weight of it. Because when we delegate things, we let go of the control and the outcomes of those things. For many of us, control is the way that we feel safest as leaders. And we have to be okay with the person who doesn't have the most information on the file. In many workplaces, information is power. Those who know the most have the most power. And you have to be able to let go of that. And the third part of that, of course, is trust. You have to trust that your team has got it. Now, it's a bit of an oxymoron, right? How are you supposed to trust people if you've never tried trusting them before? And you also have to believe that any mistakes that are created are fixable. So inside that little bit that I just talked about, there's a whole bunch of reflection pieces for you. Are you the kind of person that likes to be in control? Are you the kind of person that unequivocally trusts your team to the point where if they made a mistake, you'd be able to live with it and you'd be able to figure out a solution together to co-create a path forward? And do you, in your heart of hearts, believe that mistakes are fixable? Because many of us are living under this weight of perfection, of not wanting to make a wrong step, which, by the way, is impossible and unattainable. But if we live through that lens, it becomes very brittle in your leadership and it's almost impossible to delegate. So delegation is psychological. And that idea of asking for help, really, a lot of people equate passing off tasks to people as asking for help. And they have this convoluted concept. If they define themselves as a helper, as a giver, it's very hard for them to receive. And I just want to just put a plug in here in the podcast. Giving and receiving are synonymous actions. One feeds the other. If the energy is only going one way, going out as the giver for you as the leader, something is out of whack. You will eventually burn out. And so the other piece around delegating is this mindset of, if they can do it for me, then what is my value, my worth, my contribution? And so this forces leaders to get out of the importance of the day to day where they are comfortable. We're going to talk a lot this season about getting comfortable versus uncomfortable. It forces leaders to get out of the weeds with things and get up to the 10,000, 20, 30,000 feet. And in those new things, in those bigger things, there are, my guess is, things that you are less comfortable with. Things like outreach to people you don't know, things like bigger vision, bigger strategy, strategic relationships. So they're a little bit more intangible. They're a little bit more nebulous. Sometimes it's hard to know if they're moving forward. And so you don't get that wonderful hit of dopamine when you check something off a box on your to-do list. And I say this with love. I love my dopamine hits in the morning, but really kind of that strategic initiative or breaking it down so you can see that you're making progress. So that alignment between mothering and leading your team. Mothering ties into those fundamental core biologicals needs to protect, right? That species proliferation, if you will, and that swoop in and rescue kicks in almost automatically. And so the coaching opportunity is to take a pause, to ask yourself, is this something I need to step into? And be curious about what would happen if you didn't step in, and supporting the other person, the other staff member, to come to their own conclusions. I want to offer one more sidebar in this episode. I am doing this deep research into how the brain learns, how we can leverage coaching and conversations for real systemic change in the brain. And here's a really interesting nugget. It is always better, it is always more successful to work with a brain when you add information to a brain that already knows it. Blah, 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 blah. Let me explain that again. When you introduce a hypothetical concept or a theoretical concept, if your brain can't grab onto some piece of it and relate it to something it already knows, it is dead in the water. It is really hard to introduce that abstract concept. So an example of that is that's why we want to build on the knowledge we already have. We are scaffolding our knowledge in our brains step by step. The scaffolds actually look like neural synapses. So this is how we do this thing, and those synapses charge and light up in the brain. So that's why analogies, metaphors, or reflecting things back to people work, because they can grab onto the neural networks they currently have and extrapolate from there. And the actual physical thing that happens in your brain, I'm totally geeking out on this, is that new synapses are created. There's this misconception that as we get older, we don't create synapses. And that is not true. We are constantly creating new pathways. One thing that's interesting is when you're born, you have more pathways than any time in your life. So you have this crazy influx of pathways. You're born like that. And then as you use them, and as you grow, so as you turn 2, as you learn to walk, as you learn to use language, the synapses we're not using just disappear. So that's another important point to highlight, is what you use regularly, you expand on and grow on. What you notice continues to get noticed. And similarly, what you choose not to notice, it's like the elephant in the room. Everybody notices the elephant, right? And you can't help but see it. So understanding how your brain works, I think, is a great example of stretchiness. And in leadership, letting things go, not swooping in, not being always the person who catches everything as they go down. The coachable moment is to be able to stand alongside them, help to discern what to do to solve the problem. And yes, it does take longer, but the impact has so much more length to it, and it sticks because the employee can build on it the next time it happens. So one more parallel with mothering I want to highlight, and that has to do with your energy. Your energy matters in these situations. And if you are nervous about things, if you are anxious about your team dropping the ball, they pick up on it. If you've ever tried to quiet a colicky baby and you're anxious about what time it is, or you're anxious about the next day, or you're just distressed or thinking about something else and you're trying to calm this baby down, it doesn't work because the baby is picking up on your energy. But if you're able to centralize, ground yourself in your nervous system and exude that quiet confidence into the team, they pick up on it, they take it on as their energy, and they run with it, right? So beware of the wake you create with your movements in the office, right? Those big ski boats go by on the river, they throw this huge wake and it splashes up on the side and it erodes the sand. You, as the leader, have that kind of effect in the office, whether you like it or not. They notice your face, they notice your clothes, they notice your energy, they notice your sentiments towards certain donors, they notice your sentiments towards certain volunteers / staff. So be careful what wake you are exuding in the workplace. So the conclusion here for this wonderful podcast, gosh, it's allowed me to kind of match up things that have happened in my personal life with things that I notice in my professional life. The conclusion here is that when you mother your team, you render them incompetent, that you become the bottleneck, that they don't trust themselves because you don't trust them. And that becomes a situation of demonstrated incompetence, demonstrated helplessness. And it's a passive experience where everybody's waiting around for the leader to fix things. And that, my friends, is when you are the bottleneck. You are the problem. So, how do you feel about this analogy of mothering and leadership? Uh, there is a place at home for leadership. I also often talk about personal leadership, and there is a place for work for leadership, professional leadership. But the idea that you can separate the two and they don't intermingle, I think that's very false. And so I would prefer to use the analogies and the learnings from one to apply to the other. What do you think? Are you mothering your team too much? Think of yourself right now as a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I'm mothering them far too much. Some ways you might notice that is you asking yourself, am I spoon feeding them? Why is it that I have to repeat myself so many times? I had a wonderful coach say to me one time, my threshold is I shouldn't have to repeat things 2, 3 times in a row to make it happen. Is that happening to you? And where are your fingerprints in that experience, in that culture in your shop? I hope this podcast has inspired you to think about how you lead. I hope you can take some moments before you run back into your day to make some reflection notes. And if you'd like to follow up with me on any of these topics, mothering at the workplace, leadership, your personal leadership, I would be delighted to have that conversation. You can always reach me at jenny@chavender.com. That's Chavender like lavender, but with a CH at the beginning. You can check out my website at chavender.com. I would be most delighted to hear from you. And I always enjoy talking to listeners and learning what they care about and how I can support you in your leadership growth. Until next time, go be great.